failure to speak to the broader aspirations of ordinary people will only feed the suspicion that has festered for years that the United States pursues our interests at their expense.
After what was billed as yet another effort to reset relations with the Muslim world, what role will the U.S. now play amidst the Arab uprising? Barack Obama says it's time for a change of strategy. But did he offer any substance? And did he offer anything new on the defining conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Inside Story from Washington, D.C. I'm Shihab Rattansi. For months, millions around the Arab world have been protesting against their governments, many calling for all-out regime change. Along the way, some have asked, just what is the Obama administration's policy to the so-called Arab Spring? So, did the US president answer that question in his speech on Thursday? And on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Obama said a future Palestinian state would be based on the 1967 borders, the first time that's been explicitly stated by Barack Obama, but he didn't specify how that would happen. Kimberly Halkett has more.
Thank you very much.
A moment of opportunity, but did the president take it?
After decades of accepting the world as it is in the region, we have a chance to pursue the world as it should be.
Barack Obama, in the midst of the popular uprising sweeping the Muslim world, recognizing the region is changing, suggesting U.S. policy may no longer focus solely on its own security and energy interests, while turning a blind eye to pro-Western dictators who ignore human rights. However, there was also a clear contradiction.
And there will be times when our short-term interests don't align perfectly with our long-term vision for the region. But we can, and we will, speak out for a set of core principles.
For now, the U.S. promising aid, roughly $2 billion, to Egypt and Tunisia in the form of forgiven debt and loans to encourage trade. It's a financial incentive to other nations to adopt so-called American values of justice and freedom.
America's support for democracy will therefore be based on ensuring financial stability, promoting reform, and integrating competitive markets with each other and the global economy. And we're going to start with Tunisia and Egypt.
On the thorny issue of Israel-Palestine, Obama again endorsed two independent states.
We believe the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps, so that secure and recognized borders are established for both states.
Strong statements in support of Palestinian and Israeli interests. But after 2 years in office, little appears to have been accomplished. And while Obama tried to sound robust, a message to Israel that status quo is unsustainable, critics will again question whether those words will translate into action at all. His first opportunity Friday, when Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu makes a visit. As the White House seeks to open a new chapter in its Middle East diplomacy, what is clear, the United States now speaks to a very different Arab world, one much more intent on taking matters into its own hands.
Well, we begin our discussion first with the response of the U.S. to the protests across the Middle East. For that, we're joined here in Washington by former White House and State Department official Hillary Mann Leverett, and by the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, Shibley Telhami. And from New York, we're joined by Daniel Levy, the former senior advisor to the Israeli government during Ehud Barak's term as Prime Minister. Hillary Mann Leverett, then, after months of mixed messages and confusion, do we now have a firm idea of where President Obama and his administration stand on the change in the Arab world?
I'm afraid not. I think that Obama certainly was pressed to try to define an American narrative, but from what we're seeing with the Arab awakening in the Middle East. I think a need to do so because otherwise the narrative coming from the region is not so pleasant for American policymakers to hear. So I think he was pressed to do so, but when pressed to do so and to particularly try to bridge some of the inconsistencies that we've seen in the administration's policy, we didn't really see that. He tried to in part say why there was a different policy by the United States between Libya and Syria. But that skirted the core issue of why is it that the United States, in occasion after occasion where we've seen uprisings, why has the U.S. policy to each one of them been so incoherent? Why, he didn't give answers, for example, to why Vice President Biden, when we started to see the uprising in Egypt, why did Biden respond by saying Mubarak was not a dictator because he was friends with Israel? Why did Secretary Clinton make the exact same mistake with Syria when we started to see protests in Syria? Why did she say that the situation in Syria is different because President Bashar al-Assad is a reformer? These are the core contradictions in U.S. policies that are incoherent, and they simply were not addressed by President Obama today. He tried to put, I think, some salve on some of the issues at the margins of what we see happening. For example, this promise for more economic aid. But then again, there's probably no new money that will be appropriated by the U.S. Congress to back up these economic plans that President Obama unveiled. So there are a lot of major problems that I saw with this attempt to redefine the narrative for the region.
Is it, Professor Telhami, I mean, there is this sense perhaps that the administration still has a failure of comprehension of how great the change is, a failure of vision of how the U.S. must change. Might that be an explanation for this speech, which perhaps wasn't as clear as it might have been, and might that not reflect the rest of the Washington foreign policy establishment too?
Well, I have a different interpretation. I think that you have to look at the audiences. I think don't ignore the American audience. This is a speech, while it was in part oriented at the Middle East and North Africa, in fact, it was aimed at the American public, Congress, identifying American foreign policy in the American discourse. It was given in Washington. It was not given in Cairo or Tunis. And in that sense, the president had a very important mission here to do. And I think it's a mission not to be underestimated. And that mission is to consolidate an emerging narrative. You know, after 9/11, there was a narrative that was a difficult and painful narrative that Americans had about the Middle East. Arab uprising, the Arab awakening, has begun to change that. I've conducted public opinion polls here in the U.S. about how the American public is internalizing revolutions in the Arab world, and it's pretty positive. American views of the Arab people now are mostly positive. It's remarkable, actually, when you would consider the change. So the president, in a way, had a mission to consolidate that, because if he doesn't, then the narrative could change, as it did after 9/11. The first few weeks after 9/11, there was not such a negative narrative about the Middle East. It was differentiation between al-Qaeda and the rest of the public. And then the Bush administration didn't do a good enough job consolidating that narrative.
But the question, Professor,
narrative took place. But if I may, I just want to make the point that if you listen to the speech, a couple of things the president did. He gave an interpretation that was very coherent in terms that corresponded to the regional interpretation of what's happening. He mentioned American episodes to highlight what happened in Tunisia. He mentioned the Berlin Wall. So the images that he invoked were about, they are like us, they are like Europe. That's very important. And in that, he's trying to also get Congress and the American people to support him as he calls for aid, as he did in this particular speech. So there's that one mission that's separate from addressing Arabs and Muslims that's really important.
But Professor, I suppose the question is whether the narrative being introduced here is the correct one or is still based on the old framework. Let's play a part of this speech which seemed to explain how the administration thinks things have turned out.
The West was blamed as the source of all ills a half-century after the end of colonialism. Antagonism toward Israel became the only acceptable outlet for political expression. Divisions of tribe, ethnicity, and religious sect were manipulated as a means of holding on to power or taking it away from somebody else. But the events of the past 6 months show us that strategies of repression and strategies of diversion will not work anymore.
Daniel Levy, so is that correct then? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was simply an unscrupulous diversion by, frankly, US-backed regimes. That backing was simply a diversion. This post-colonial backing for these regimes was a diversion. Isn't the US itself now stoking tensions between Sunni and Shia as it keeps on harping on about Iran? I mean, what does it all mean?
I think that was not the most glorious moment of the speech. The idea, and we've seen that, of course, we saw that on Sunday during the Nakba Day protests, and we'll continue to see it. The idea that the Arab leaders sent their people out to be angry about Israel and the plight of the Palestinians, and now the people can fend for themselves. They really won't give a damn about the Palestinians. Not that that's exactly what the president said, but the narrative of which that is a part, of course, is a misplaced narrative. But I still think the US suffers from an exaggerated emphasis on Iran, although I don't think today's speech went too far in indulging that. Look, first of all, as Shibley said, this has an American audience, and I think it's important for the president to try and keep an American audience engaged in the world during these times. I think the president tried to acknowledge up front that there will be inconsistencies, and I think he tried to take some of the sting out of the charge of hypocrisy by saying, anyone who thinks I'm not going to mention the Bahrainis by name, okay, here's Bahrain. Anyone who thinks I'm not going to challenge Prime Minister Netanyahu a bit, here's my challenge to Netanyahu. Of course, the hypocrisies and the inconsistencies will still be there. I think the president did a not bad job given his political realities, but there's another side to this, which is this is a Middle East story. This is an Arab story. This isn't an American story. And to the extent to which this, to a degree, intentionally or otherwise, drew something of a line over the American hubris, we control all of this, I think it was a good thing. And I think people will also, I hope there is new monies appropriated or new debts relieved. I think people will appreciate that in Egypt and Tunisia, albeit people will remember that the Mubarak regime was the recipient of $2 billion a year in American assistance. And the key question is what happens going forward? Will the American president respect the choices of the more democratic, responsive to public opinion regimes in the region? Will he respect the choices of who they choose to elect, unlike what happened in the Palestinian territories in 2006? Will America respect a more independent foreign policy, for instance, a more independent regional policy from Egypt and from others? That's going to be the test. The test is going to be in the granularity of American responses to things that bump up against domestic American political pressures especially.
Hillary Mann Leverett, though, at least if we're looking for something practical, though, might we at least know who's being thrown under the bus? President Assad might have limited time, but Prime Minister Saleh and the Bahrainis are still called friends of America and so forth. Is that the only practical thing we can get out of this for the moment?
Well, perhaps, but I also want to come back to the issue of why it was even given in Washington. I think it's a little bit too generous to give the president the benefit of the doubt that he gave the speech in Washington in a benevolent way to lead the American public toward a greater good, a good goal. The fact is that the president of the United States, unlike his situation 2 years ago in June 2009, when he had a variety of venues to look at in the Middle East to deliver his speech to the Muslim world, today he would not be welcome in many Middle Eastern capitals. Today he couldn't go. When Secretary of State Clinton was in Cairo, many of the people who are in the opposition in Cairo who are now going to be leaders in the next Egyptian government wouldn't meet with her. So the president had very limited opportunities for where he could go. He may not be welcome in Saudi Arabia. It took weeks for our senior officials to be received by King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia. So, you know, his options, if we look back at the region and the hopes that the region had, the Middle East had for Obama upon his inauguration in January 2009, and when he was received so warmly in the spring of 2009, both in Turkey and in Egypt. Today, that's just not the case. His numbers, his poll numbers have plummeted. The standing of the United States has plummeted. Both, you know, Shibley has done some really important polls, but the Pew Foundation has polls out this week that shows that the standing of the United States in the region and Obama's standing in the region have actually suffered since the start of the Arab awakening in December. These are significant changes in the Middle East that Obama is really reacting to rather than leading. And I think the one area here where perhaps he is trying to get ahead of the domestic political curve is that he knows that Newt Gingrich is going to be a serious contender for him in the 2012 presidential election. And Newt Gingrich has put out there front and center, he has challenged Obama in terms of where does Obama stand regarding American exceptionalism, America's role in the world. And so I think Obama is trying to defend against what will be an attack from Newt Gingrich about American relevance in the Middle East and American strength in the Middle East.
But Professor Telhami, when Obama says, look, there'll be times our short-term interests don't align perfectly with our long-term vision of the region, but we will at least speak out for principles, is that for the congressional, is that exceptionalism? Is that for his congressional audience? Isn't it simply saying, look, we can't do anything because the Saudis won't let us?
Well, you know, I think it's, as I said, he has multiple audiences, and I think in good part, it's about the American audience. He is obviously also addressing the Arab audiences. You know, how it's going to be received in the Arab world in general, and as you know, I do polling in the Arab world, The Arab world has consistently evaluated American foreign policy largely over the Arab-Israeli issue. And in that sense, what he says about the other stuff, as Daniel said, this is not an American revolution. It's not even an American instigated revolution. In fact, the Arab world rejected Bush's attempt to spread democracy by force. And the beauty about what happened so far in the Arab world has been that it's indigenous, and that's the power of it, that's the inspiration of it. And the U.S. really can't make this about America. So when the Arab public is listening to the U.S., sure, they want economic aid, particularly in places like Egypt and Tunisia, but in the end, they want to hear about the issue that matters a lot to them, where they think America matters most, and that is the Arab-Israeli issue. And here, I think,
Professor,
essentially, the administration decided to kick the can forward rather than deal with it at this point.
And you've also helped us bring our program, or at least move our program a bit more forward. We wanted to move on to that topic right now. The US president, that was not rehearsed. The US president said that any negotiations should result in 2 states based on the 1967 borders between Israel and the Palestinians. But he also had a warning for unilateral Palestinian moves.
For over 2 years, my administration has worked with the parties and the international community to end this conflict, building on decades of work by previous administrations. Yet expectations have gone unmet. Israeli settlement activity continues. Palestinians have walked away from talks. The world looks at a conflict that has grinded on and on and on and sees nothing but stalemate. For the Palestinians, efforts to delegitimize Israel will end in failure. Symbolic actions to isolate Israel at the United Nations in September won't create an independent state. Palestinian leaders will not achieve peace or prosperity if Hamas insists on a path of terror and rejection.
Daniel Levy, there was a great deal of drama leading up to this speech. Will he or won't he substantively address the Israeli-Palestinian issue? Now this is being presented as throwing down the gauntlet to Prime Minister Netanyahu as he arrives in Washington over this issue of 67 borders. Is it throwing down the gauntlet?
Whether it was intended to or not, and I actually think it was intended to, Netanyahu has responded as if it was throwing down the gauntlet. And ironically, a speech which I think was designed to be wrapping one's arms around the region, the Arab world, pressing a second time this reset button, will end up being remembered more for the Israel-Palestine part because of the way Netanyahu has responded. Now, what happened, and by the way, I'm sure your viewers will be following this, Netanyahu has really kicked back and said no to 67. We have to be in the Jordan Valley indefinitely. We have to have our settlement. So he's pushed back heavily against the president.
But isn't that part
now,
of...
I think what we've seen here...
Isn't that part of Mr. Netanyahu's usual strategy, though? That he will kick up a fuss, even though that he knows there's no peace process anyway. So 67 borders aren't really relevant right now. What is relevant, though, is Palestinian statehood being declared at the UN General Assembly in September, and that's what he's actually got what he wanted there.
Yeah, may I say something?
Look, first,
Professor, we'll get to you in a second.
Look, first of all, when President Obama says going to the UN is just a symbolic thing, elsewhere in his speech, he says, look, we can't make things happen, we can just speak. So a huge contradiction there. But I think what has happened is that President Obama has consciously, having been rebuffed by the Israeli Prime Minister, and having said to the Prime Minister, the strategic environment around you is changing, you need to adapt, give me something to work with, Mr. Netanyahu. And Netanyahu gave him nothing. That all having happened, President Obama decided to try to take the challenge to Netanyahu's backyard. It normally happens the other way. Netanyahu goes to Congress and mobilizes Congress against Obama. Obama has tried to insert himself with this speech into the internal Israeli debate. I think it's going to be uncomfortable for Prime Minister Netanyahu. Not uncomfortable beyond what he can stand, because just like that clip that we heard, Obama is still himself too constricted. I mean, when he criticizes the Palestinians from walking away from talks and the Israelis for continuing settlements, well, really, there's no equivalent there. One is a violation of international law, settlements, and the other is a political tactic. But still, this is going to be, in the strictly internal Israeli context, a sticky moment for Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Professor Telhami, go ahead.
Well, there are 2 points I want to make on this. The way I read this about his statement about the UN General Assembly is that the administration still believes it has some possibility of making an effort to revive negotiations before, and they probably will try to do something in August. Whether it will work or not, that's the way I read it. But one of the interesting things in that speech that has not been highlighted as much is not the 67 borders. That's been sort of expected. It was more about a term when the president said full withdrawal of Israeli forces must be coordinated. Now, the full withdrawals of Israeli forces indicates that essentially the president is saying there will be no Israeli forces in the Jordan Valley or any part of what might become the Palestinian state. That's a very strong language, and that I think is actually rather new, because while the U.S. is acknowledging Israeli security and the need for Israel to have the capacity to defend itself, it seems as if that is a new introduction of a new element in the American position.
Hillary Mann Leverett, a bold new move?
Well, you know, I think it's something that we've been hearing about since 2000, since the Clinton administration dealt with it at Taba. So it's 11 years in the making. It's hard to see how this is really a bold new move. I think the other critical piece here, though, is Obama's backhanded recognition that the United States is going to have to start dealing with Islamist movements in the region. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is an obvious one, and he focused in the speech in a backhanded way on Hamas. But instead of actually coming up with something bold and new, which is that everybody who has a concern about the conflict should be at the table, including Hamas, without preconditions, he doubled down on his predecessor's preconditions about what Hamas would need to do to enter into a negotiation, essentially to give up all of the gains that they would get from coming through a negotiation, for them to do it unilaterally before a negotiation would start. This is going to be very problematic, particularly as the United States itself is negotiating without condition with the Taliban in Afghanistan, but we cannot be negotiating with Hamas. It's going to be a problem for us not only in the Israeli-Palestinian context, but with Hezbollah in the broader Arab-Israeli arena, and with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
Daniel Levy, wasn't that a problem? Again, he's not really connecting. He's not really making that shift that the Arab Spring might suggest he has to actually look at the Arab world from the viewpoint of the Arabs themselves. He's still looking at it from the point of view of Washington.
Of course, because he gets re-elected in the United States and his day-to-day business is conducted in Washington. He, I think, got the Hamas part of the speech horribly wrong. His emphasis on Hamas was the recognition of Israel's right to exist, when literally the same day you have Prime Minister Netanyahu refusing to recognize a Palestinian state on 67 or any Palestinian rights. I think had the Hamas part of the speech, so to speak, been an emphasis on adhering to international law, on the non-use of violence against civilians, that would have been a much smarter way for the president to go. And in that respect, we're somewhat in retreat from Cairo 2009. I still see that in the context of what the president was trying to do in terms of how this plays out in Israel, because Netanyahu had come forward on Monday at the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and basically given his three no's. No to Palestinian sovereignty, we're going to stay in the Jordan Valley as Israel. No to the 67 lines, we're keeping all of Jerusalem at the very least, plus settlements. And no to reconciliation, because we refuse to talk honestly about 1948. And so I think, from what Shibley pointed out regarding no permanent Israeli military presence, by this new use of language about the 67 lines, not dramatic, as Hillary says, it's 2011 for heaven's sake, but still dramatically different from President Bush. Remember, President Bush made a commitment, and this is what everyone's going to be talking about in Israel tonight. President Bush made a commitment to taking into account the settlement blocks and the Israeli population centers. It doesn't mean that Obama doesn't think that, but he wasn't willing to say it for Netanyahu's sake tonight, because these are two people not happy with each other.
Very quickly, got 30 seconds. Wouldn't it have made sense to connect the Arab Spring and the Israeli-Palestinian issue by using those principles that America was against violence and repression and was for the universal rights of free speech and peaceful assembly? He didn't want to link that to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, did he?
Exactly, and he didn't recognize what he should have recognized, which is the ongoing weekly protests by Palestinians whose land is being confiscated in non-violent protests, the fact that many of them are now in prisons. He should have wrapped his arm around that. I think it may have been a political stretch too far. That's a great shame.
Daniel Levy, thank you very much. Professor Telhami, thank you also. Hillary Mann Leverett, thank you. And thank you for joining us here on this special edition of Inside Story from Washington, D.C. We welcome your comments. Email them to insidestory@aljazeera.net.